Welcome everybody, this is SharePoint Patterns and Practices webcast, and this time we're going to talk about different options of getting your data from SharePoint when you're writing your own SharePoint Framework solution. My name is Vesa Juvonen, I'm a Senior Program Manager from SharePoint Engineering, and with me today, responsible of the demo is Waldek Mastukarts. Waldek will do the intros as well.
Hi everybody, my name is Waldek Mastukarts. I work at Encore. I am Office Development MVP. And today we'll talk about getting data from SharePoint in SharePoint Framework solutions. Absolutely.
So we're going to cover through the different options and different kind of approaches of getting the data from SharePoint. So you might be familiar of getting the data using raw REST, or you might come from a, let's say, a classic SharePoint background, so you're familiar of using JavaScript object model in the context of SharePoint. And really the purpose of this webcast is kind of show the differences, what's the advantage of using a different option. And we'll walk through the JavaScript object model, raw REST operations, the HTTP REST approaches in the SharePoint framework, and also SharePoint JavaScript core library, which is coming from the PnP initiative. So we will have a walkthrough of different options in slides first, actually as a one slide, and then Waldek is going to do a live demo on the differences as well. Before we go to the actual content, just quickly explaining SharePoint Patterns and Practices is a open source initiative which is coordinated by the SharePoint Engineering, but we work together with community. So all of the stuff what we are contributing is dependent on the contributions of the community as well. And one of the benefits out of that one is that these are real-world learnings as well. So whenever somebody is hitting or solving issues with customers, we can actually share them through the SharePoint PnP for others in the community, and everybody can benefit out of those learnings as well. The SharePoint PnP provides code samples, guidance documentation. We have open community calls, actually on a weekly basis, and a monthly calls, and bi-weekly special interest group calls. Then we have case studies available. The areas are on SharePoint Framework, SharePoint add-ins, Microsoft Graph, Office 365 in general. And everything in SharePoint, not everything, but mature, some of the areas in the SharePoint which are suitable absolutely applies to on-premises as well. SharePoint Framework, as an example, will land on-premises to SharePoint 2016 during calendar year of 2017. So if you learn to use SharePoint Framework now in SharePoint Online, it will be then usable in on-premises later this year, depending obviously on which year you're watching this video. HTTP AKMS SharePoint PnP is the one address to remember. Now, let's jump directly on today's topic. And really the key point of this topic and webcast is to cover two different options when you are accessing data in the SharePoint side. And the first option, when you're actually accessing the data, accessing from JavaScript, the SharePoint online data, is the classic SharePoint object model. We introduced the SharePoint JavaScript object model. JavaScript object model was introduced in SharePoint 2010, so it's pretty old already, and it's kind of implemented in a classic JavaScript way. It mimics heavily client-side object model from an operation perspective. It works with delegates, so that's a kind of a big difference on let's say, a modern web stack development models. It does not support promises, which could be a massive deal when you're implementing your implementation or client-side web part. And there's no investments what we're doing this one anymore from an engineering perspective. So it's absolutely supported. We're not going to take that away. But we're not investing heavily on the JavaScript object model for time being. Then for all of these options, like we started with JavaScript object model, we have these three different, let's say, aspects which we're kind of a rating as well. Because we are no longer investing on JavaScript object model, we don't consider that really as a future-proof, and that's why there's an exclamation mark on that section. The coverage for JSOM is fair. It's not actually that big if we compare that to all of the REST APIs and which are available within SharePoint. And the ease of use is actually hard, especially considering SharePoint framework deployment. If you do a, let's say, script editor web part and you plug in your JavaScript there, somebody might obviously say that no, that's not hard, that's super easy. I'll just go to let's say Google or Bing and find the relevant JavaScript and just paste it in. But that's not necessarily really future-proof proof for your customization. And it might not be considered as a, let's say, a controlled way of doing development as well. Anything you want to add, Waldek, on this one?
Yeah, so JSON, in order to use that, you have to load a few scripts, and the trick is that you have to load them in the right order, or things will break. So that's the one thing that to some degree, depending on what you wanted to use, was done already for you in the past, but on the modern side with SPFX, you have to do all of that by yourself. Sure. Because JSON is not available already on a page. So you have to load it by yourself, and you have to do it correctly. Then another thing that you have to take into account is that the way JSON works, as we said, it mimics JSON, right? So you have to work with the context, you have to work with queries, and if you've worked with another API, let's say based on REST, then there is no reference for you because JSON works in a unique way. So you have to learn that API in order to use it. So you cannot benefit of anything that you've learned elsewhere because that API is unique, if you will.
True.
So that's why we said that it is hard. And also there are some quirks which you will see in a demo. Like for example, if you want to load list but not the whole list, only part of it, then there are some tricks that you have to know, and it's not easy to find how it all works. So with that, it's quite hard comparing to other approaches that are available to you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think the key point what you said is the fact that it's a unique API. It's not consistent. It's not consistent of anything what's out there. And it's really, and obviously we should have done a better job from a documentation perspective for this one, which could be one of the reasons why it's super hard to use. One of the things actually on the JavaScript object model, somebody just actually yesterday said this to me, related on the benefits of the JavaScript object model, is that it has a nice batching capability for your operation, which is true. You can easily do batching relatively in the same way as client-side object model in .NET. You're essentially queuing up your commands and then you execute them. But you can do batching using the other options as well. And we'll come back on that one in the options. Good. Now, the second option, and this is not really a library, it's just considering the fact that, hey, let's do raw REST. So essentially use whatever is the suitable approach for the JavaScript library what you're using, because depending on a React or Angular or whatever, they might have a slightly different options. And the raw REST essentially is that you're hitting the HTTP endpoint and getting access on the information. The advantage is no doubt is that it's the same across technology stacks. So it doesn't matter if you're writing .NET code or JavaScript or Node.js operations, the way to use the REST API is exactly the same. It is super easy for GET requests because you just hit the GET request and then you're good to go. But it's actually super complex for non-GET requests because you need to figure out all of the additional plumbing. You need to get the form digests and everything else and do the headers and JSON objects and all of that within your code. Raw REST, no doubt, is an evergreen because, well, it is the endpoint on the other side of the SharePoint. But then there is the additional complexity. It is a future-proof, which is kind of understandable. The coverage is excellent because obviously with raw REST, every single REST API is available for you to hit. So it's not a library as such, like mentioned. But all of the APIs which we are releasing are essentially available for you to take into use. And no doubt, maybe a small sidestep. Yes, we are working on a better documentation on our REST APIs as well, which no doubt should be there. Easy of use is moderate. It's not super easy, but it's not super hard, especially if you're getting the information from SharePoint side. Anything you want to add, Waldek, on this one?
I would stress two things, right? So first of all is that, as you said, it works exactly the same across stacks. So no matter if you build phone app, OS app, or web app, it will work exactly the same everywhere. because it just REST, right? You just issue a web request and you get a response, and it is exactly the same everywhere. Another thing is that, as you said, it's easy for GET requests, but beyond that, it's challenging, right? Because for a post or a put, you have to know exactly the objects that you have to send, and they are not always trivial, right? So that's one thing. And then another thing is, if you would like to batch the requests, it is supported. There is a way to do it, but it's not trivial as well, right? Because
Sure.
the response that you get spans multiple requests, and you have to parse all of that by yourself, right? So with that, it is easier than JSON, but it's still quite labor intensive, if you will.
True, no doubt. So natively in SharePoint Framework, then because obviously the raw REST is like I said, it is a labor intensive. We wanted to help on making things happen more easily. And in SharePoint Framework, there is an SP HTTP client, which is essentially making the operations and REST API calls more easily available for the developers. This is a SharePoint Framework specific implementation. So if it's you can access the API from the SharePoint Framework libraries. It's easy for all kinds of requests, so you can actually more easily handle. Well, it takes care of the plumbing for you for many of the complexity, for example, in post operations. For non-GET operation, you'll still need to create the JSON object, which is understandable. So you need to go and have a look on the object structure itself. What are we actually posting towards SharePoint? That the REST API knows then how to handle the incoming messages. And it's evergreen. The SharePoint framework absolutely is evergreen as well. The coverage is excellent because, again, it is exactly the same coverage as with the raw REST. What we're essentially doing is that we're making the plumbing to happen in a hidden way, so you don't need to worry about that one. And ease of use is kind of rated as moderate plus, essentially easier than raw REST, but it's not super easy either, because every now and then you need to still build, for example, just JSON objects. You need to have a look on the structure and all of that. Anything you want to add on this one?
Yeah, I think that the one way you could see it is that it is a wrapper around raw REST. So you still work with URLs, you still write exactly the endpoints that you want to hit, you still construct the objects for post and put, but there are a few prerequisites that you don't need to worry about them yourself. So that's why using the SP HTTP client is easier than working with the raw REST.
Absolutely. And then the final piece of the puzzle, or let's say an option, obviously it's debatable. Is it only 4 options? There's multiple other libraries out there as well. But one of the things which we're actually super proud, and we want to raise that in these discussions as well, is the community-driven PnP core, because this is actually super easily approachable API for accessing the information within SharePoint. It is a fluent API, so you're able to do stuff like pnp.web.lists, .fields, and you actually get access on the fields. You don't have to explicitly do the REST operation. So all of that complexity is hidden under the covers. So you can just access, you get a object which you can then manipulate and get access to the data. It works natively with promises, which is a big thing, obviously as well. So you don't have to do anything, any additional implementation on that. It is an open source community-driven initiative, so this is not something what SharePoint Framework and SharePoint Engineering is pushing out. This is an open source initiative. Obviously, from a usage perspective, this is a great tool to be used in a browser, but if you're writing, for example, a mobile app, the PnP core is not available because it is a JavaScript library. And at that point, you need to do raw REST or whatever library could be suitable for your that platform. The coverage of PnP core is fair. It is not exposing all of the different REST APIs, what is available there, but it's already exposing the typical set of REST APIs, and it's expanding all the time. And also the ease of use is no doubt easy, because it is actually super easy to get the data and even post the data and create items in a SharePoint site. And we kind of showed that one in practice during the demo as well. Waldek, anything you want to add on this one?
Yeah, I think that the benefit of that approach is that you get intelligence.
True.
When you work with REST, you basically type strings. And as with the strings, you can have typos, parameters might be incorrect. And the only way for you to actually check if everything works as it's supposed to is to do it on runtime or write some really complex tasks that will basically try to mimic the whole flow. Whereas with PnP JS Core, you basically work with Fluent API that has TypeScript types. So everything that you write, all of the requests, the operations, all of that will be already checked when you write the code immediately. And if there is anything wrong, you will know it immediately. So that's a really great benefit there, right?
True. It does increase the productivity of the developers enormously. So no doubt, great benefit. Now,
and one thing that I wanted to ask, and I might put you here a bit on a spot, is do you know if it works in Node.js?
It does. It does work in a Node.js as well.
So with that, you could be able to write server-side code that would use that approach, right? And with that, you could have a end-to-end JavaScript-based code base to simplify your code.
True. That is absolutely correct. So it's not just for browser.
For client.
Yes, exactly. You can implement server-side implementations out of it as well. So good. Cool. So a lot of talking, different options, but let's actually have a look on this in practice. So let's jump to a demo. Waldek's going to walk through or a few of our existing samples, which are available in the PnP. In the GitHub under the SharePoint organization, and then we'll come back on the slides and close up the webcast. So let's jump to the demo and start checking what does it actually mean in practice.
All right. So now that you've seen or heard actually what the different approaches are to load data from SharePoint site, how about we have a look at the code, how these approaches look in practice. So first of all, we have a web part, a SharePoint Framework web part that uses the SharePoint JSON to get the data from a list. So here, let me first start the web part so that you can see it in action. And then based on that, we will just go quickly through the code to see how it works, how it's built, and what the different prerequisites are that you have to take into account before you even can start working with JSON. Yeah. So now the project builds, bundles, transpiles, serves, and now we will go to a hosted version of the Workbench so that we can communicate with lists and actually get data. So here, let's add the web part. And here we have a button that gets me the list of lists in this site. And with a click, there you go. There's the list of all the lists in this site.
Mind-blowing UI design, by the way.
Excellent. I mean, it's just fantastic, isn't it?
It's
All right, let's stop the web part and close terminal. All right, so if you've worked with the SharePoint JSON in the past, you know the way it works. First of all, you have to have the context, right? And here, because we are in the Workbench, we don't get that for free. So we have to create it ourselves. And we create it by passing in the URL of a current site. Then we want to get a list of all lists in this site, but we don't want to get for every list the whole list. Because we only show a title, we only want to get that to minimize the overhead that we pull in. So with that, we call the context get web, the current web. From web, get the current list. And then we do a trick where we say load the collection, but only include title. And this syntax is specific to JavaScript OM. You won't find it anywhere else, right? So you have to know that this is the way it works. And now, because we only call the load, well, the load itself only adds an operation to the batch, but it doesn't really execute the operation. So in order for us to actually run the operation and get data, we have to call the execute query async method, and only then JSON will execute the call, the REST call, and will get the data through which we have to enumerate, as you can see here, to actually get the lists, right? And that works with a delegate that we pass here, right? So all of that is a delegate. So this is the way it works, and it's not really convenient, if you will, right? Because you have to know about enumerators, you have to know about calling the execute, loading, you have to know how to filter the objects that actually load in here. So you have to know about all of that. But there is more to it. In order for you to even be able to use JSON in SharePoint Framework, you first have to load the scripts, because out of the box they are not available on the page. And one way to do that is to go to your config JSON, which is here, and then in externals, you have to add all these entries. And they have to be exactly added that way. Because what you see here are not only the URLs, which, by the way, must be absolute URLs in your site. Externals do not work with relative URLs, because a relative URL would be relative comparing to the path where the source code is located and not relative to your site, so that would not work. So you have to include the full URL, and then you have to have the name, but also you have to use these guys, dependencies, to specify the order in which framework should load all the scripts. Because if you load them incorrectly, you will get error, because these scripts depend on each other. Right, so they might have a reference to a script that's supposed to be already available, and if it's not, you will have error. So you have to do all of that. And there is also another way to load these scripts in code, right, so that you can work with a relative URL, but you still have to get through all the hoops in loading all the scripts in the right order in order to be able to use them. Right, and there are also typings that you have to load as well, so that you can get TypeScript types, right? And you can find them. These are the types that you have to load. So there is the type SharePoint and type Ajax. These are the two things that you have to install as well. So only then you need all of that in order to be able to use it. We just talked also that there are three other approaches, right? There's the raw REST, which you would typically use, let's say, in Angular. There's the SP HTTP client that you get in SharePoint Framework, and there is the SP PnP JS core library. So how about we have a look at that as well? The first
Sounds good.
Yep. Awesome. We have another sample for that, so let's quickly run that as well.
And by the way, on the samples and everything, we'll add those in the video notes and the blog post, so you can easily access these samples in the future. So
yeah, we will actually paste all of the code in video so that you will be able to type it. All right, let me remove the web part, refresh the page. There's a chance that the web part will reappear. No, it doesn't. Very good. And now we have samples here, and they work exactly the same way. So if I add Angular, React, STP, PnP, they work exactly the same way. The only thing that is not the same is actually the code. So let's grab the one in Angular. Let's quickly set the list, the name of our list, test, and then in that we can create new items. We can read them, we can read all items, we can change them, delete them. So basically for every operation in CRUD, so create, read, update, delete, we have an operation implemented in code so that you can see exactly how it works. How it works in Angular, in React, in no framework at all, and then with SP PnP JS. So now let's have a look in code how it works. There's our CRUD sample. Let's stop that so that we will get a little bit more screen estate here. And first of all, let's have a look at the Angular web part that shows how you work with raw REST. So here is our service, and here are the different operations that we have. So first of all, well, in Angular, when you work with raw REST, or if you would do the same in jQuery, Knockout, or Vue, you work with raw REST. So whenever you perform let's first have a look at a get operation. So that's simple. You only issue a web call, you say get API URL, and you're done. And in the response, you actually get JSON object with which you can work. If you, however, want to create an item or issue a non-get operation, there are quite a few steps that you have to take into account. So first of all, when you create an item, you have to get the type of object that you have to send in your post operation. And that's called a list item entity type name. You can get it from an API, but that's the first step that you have to do, right? So that's the one call here. Then when you have that, you have to get the request digest. That's basically a security measure so that the API knows that you are allowed to issue the call because you perform a non-get operation. Yeah, okay. And then the next step is you have to then create the body of your post request. So here you can see that we pass the type that we got initially here. And then we say title of our new item that we want to create in the list. Then we issue the post call with all of the body, and only then we are done. And we have to do that ourselves, all of it. We don't get anything for free, right? So we have to go through all of that. And we have to go through all of that for create, delete, update, all of that, right? So that might be cumbersome, but the good thing is if you build apps, let's say in Angular, iOS, Node.js, it works exactly the same across all of them because in none of them you have something. So you have to build all of that by yourself. Right? It might not be efficient at first, but once you do it a few times, you will get all of it of how it works. Another way that you can use is, for example, in React, is to use the SP HTTP client that you get with the web part. And that's a really key part because if you look at the API, there are actually two of them. There is the regular HTTP client, but there is also the SP HTTP client. And there are some nuances, difference between them. And the most important one is that when you use the HTTP client, that does not send cookies that you have currently set. So if you would try to use that by accident and would try to call the SharePoint REST API, every single call would be 403 unauthorized. Forbidden, actually. Why? Because the cookie that you currently have set in browser would not be sent along, right? So every single call would fail, and it might take a moment for you to actually figure out why, right? So actually the difference is whenever you want to call SharePoint APIs, you always have to use the SP HTTP client, and for all other APIs, you use the HTTP client, right? So that's an important part for you to take into account.
And to be fair on that one, the whole purpose is that the SP HTTP client is making stuff easier for you. So
absolutely,
technically you don't have to use that, but if you wouldn't be using that, then you would have to deal with the cookies and everything else and authentication model and blah, blah, blah. So
absolutely. And with that, let's say, for example, let's have a look at operations like, let's start with read, right? So with read, another one, we just issue a get call. That's simple, right? We don't need to do much here. But then for create, what you do here is that we start with the list item entity type name. So we still have to do that. But then as you can see here, we don't need to get the request digest ourselves. We get that already for free, and we don't even need to attach that to headers because all of that is already being done by the client that we use. Right? So that's actually the benefit, that it takes away one operation that otherwise we would have to do ourselves. And then with the digest, another thing that you have to keep in mind, that it expires. So it's not enough to get it just once, right? Because it expires every 3 minutes or a minute. right? So when it expires, you have to actually get new one. So you either have to get new one every single time you want to do a non-get operation, or you would get it once and then keep track of its expiry date, and when it expired, you would get new one. With the SP HTTP client, you don't need to do any of that because you get all of that for free, right? So that's another benefit there. And then finally, we have the SP PnP JS library, and that is just very easy. So here, let's say you want to get an item from a list. So you say PnP SP web lists, because we want to get an item from a list. We first get the list by name, and then we get an item by ID. And from that item, we only want to have title and ID. Get. Done. Only this line. There is no strings. Well, the only strings that we have are actually the name of the fields we want to get. But other than that, it's just Fluent API. And let's say I would make typo here. I see that immediately as an error.
So you have a nice intelligence and all of that checking.
Exactly, because all of that is just Fluent API. So here I could also do PnP SP web lists, get by title. Let's enter an empty title for now, and here I would say items, and here I can say things like filter, like order, right? So you get objects for all of these operations that otherwise you would have to do in a URL as a string, and for which there is a risk that you might type it incorrectly or do it wrong, and which you would only see on runtime, whereas here you see it directly here in code. And then another interesting thing is that if we go, for example, to create item, look at how short this call is. True. Right? So we say get the list, which is that part here, items, add new one, title, done. So look that we do not need to get the list item entity type name. We get that for free. We also get a digest for free as well. And we also do not need to create the whole post object. We only pass the object, the really short part, which is actually the body of the item that we want to create. So that's really simple. Compare this. Let me open that for you side by side. So here you can see the short one that we get from the SP PnP JS. Let me actually close the pane. And here, let's have a look at the CRUD that you would have to otherwise do yourself. So here you have the create item, which fits exactly on the screen, right? Whereas that just only takes a few lines of code. So here you have to get the list item entity type name. You have to get, or actually, we could even compare it to Angular. So imagine that you would just use raw REST to make it really fair. Imagine that raw REST, right? So here you have the get list item entity type name. You have to do that first. Then you need to have a digest. Then you have to have the body with the type in it as well, title. And then only then you actually do post, and you have to write all of that by yourself. And if you would do a typo here, you won't see it in code because it is string, right? So you will only see it on runtime. Whereas here you work with objects. So you see everything you type incorrectly, you see immediately. So that is a big benefit and makes it really easy for you to work with REST in a way, because this API works internally with REST, right? So that makes it easier for you to work through REST eventually. Anything I missed? Anything else you want to see?
No, I think that's it for this one. I think we touched the key points, and this is an awesome, let's say, comparison. Why the PnP JS core, no doubt, does provide value. There is the coverage of the PnP JS core isn't the same as all of the REST APIs, but for basic operations, absolutely worthwhile to have a closer look on how it's working. And the intelligence is pretty awesome, and the developer time checking of the code as well. But I think that should be enough for the demo. So let's flip back on the slides unless you have anything on this side.
No, I'm cool.
Cool. Let's go back on and close up the webcast. Good. Thank you, Waldek, one more time for the great demo, and also one more time and also thank you for joining on the webcast recording. I think this is a super valuable webcast to go through the different options, and one of the things what no doubt we would encourage is to have a look on the SPPNP, the PnP core library, if it's suitable for you as well, and if it feels good for you to use, because that's no doubt the easiest way to do operations, like you saw in the demo as well. The JavaScript object model, like mentioned when we went through the slides, it is already, it was released back in 2010, and we're not really investing on it. Absolutely supported option in the SharePoint, but it's not something. It's not really a future-proof as such. REST APIs, absolutely. The REST API is the future of SharePoint remote APIs. And maybe a side note on that one, we're not going to actually stop releasing .NET CSOM APIs either, but the REST API is always evolving faster. And then the SP HTTP request or the SharePoint Framework REST API wrapper is no doubt a helpful fellow as well. Anything you want to add, Waldek? Just quickly walk through the different options.
Of course. I like to encourage you to check out the code that we share and try for yourself how each approach works, and based on that, choose one that makes that is actually the best match for you. And as we said, JSON is it's not developed anymore. So if you've worked with that in the past, I would encourage you even more to have a look at the other three options that we've shown and try to use one of them instead.
Absolutely, absolutely. Good recommendation. But I think that's it for this webcast. So thank you, Waldek, for joining, and we'll come up with a new webcast sooner or later. Thank you.
Bye, guys.